My name is Arthur, at least it was. I'm not so sure who I am anymore. Before all this, my life was a meticulously arranged collection of mundane certainties. I worked as a financial analyst, a job that rewarded skepticism and cold, hard data. My apartment was minimalist, my relationships were uncomplicated, and my belief in anything beyond the observable world was non-existent. Ghosts, spirits, curses, they were the stuff of campfire stories, the products of overwrought imaginations, and creaky old houses settling in the night. I was a man who believed in foundations, in blueprints, in the solid, reassuring logic of cause and effect. Then came the layoff. It was sudden, a casualty of a corporate restructuring that nobody saw coming. My perfectly ordered life imploded. Savings dwindled with alarming speed, and the pressure from my family to figure things out was a constant, suffocating weight. Desperation is a powerful acid. It burns through pride, certainty, and, in my case, career aspirations. That's how I found myself taking a job as a night guard at the Whaley House Museum. It was a means to an end, a way to staunch the financial bleeding while I searched for something more respectable. I saw it as a temporary purgatory, a quiet place to lick my wounds and recalibrate. The irony is not lost on me now. The museum manager, a kindly, slightly eccentric woman named Eleanor, gave me the tour. She spoke of the Whaley family with a familiarity that bordered on reverence, pointing out the courtroom where justice was once dispensed and the small, sad bedroom where Violet Whaley had ended her own life. She mentioned the house's reputation, of course, but she did it with a wink and a smile, as if sharing an inside joke. "Some people say they hear things at night," she'd said, her voice light. "Old houses have their own language, don't they?" I'd nodded, offering a tight, professional smile. Old houses creak, wind howls, pipes groan. Every sound has a source. That's what I told myself. I had control over my reality. My first few weeks were a testament to the profound silence of the dead. I'd make my rounds, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the oppressive darkness, illuminating dust motes dancing in the still air. The house was a time capsule, filled with the scent of old wood, decaying paper, and a faint, cloying hint of lavender. I'd sit at the small security desk in the gift shop, reading novels, studying stock market trends on my phone, and listening to the profound nothingness. The silence was my companion, a confirmation of my rational worldview. The world of the past was dead, locked away behind velvet ropes and glass cases. I was merely its custodian. The incursions began subtly, as they always do. It started with a sound, so faint I almost dismissed it as a product of my own fatigue. A slow, heavy tread from the floor above. Thump, thump, thump. It was the sound of a large man, walking with a deliberate, almost mournful pace. My first thought was logical. A late tourist, somehow missed during closing. I grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight, my heart thrumming a slightly faster rhythm, and went to investigate. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the cavernous silence. Museums closed. I swept the beam of my light across the second-floor landing, the old courtroom, the master bedroom. Nothing. The dust on the floorboards was undisturbed. The air was still. I checked the windows, all sealed shut. The doors were locked. I was alone. I chalked it up to the house settling, or perhaps the sound of a branch scraping against the roof. An easy explanation. I returned to my desk, the silence feeling a little less companionable now, a little more watchful. But the footsteps returned the next night, and the night after that. Always the same time, just after 2 a.m. Always the same ponderous, heavy gait, pacing back and forth in the courtroom upstairs. It became a sinister punctuation mark in my nightly routine. I started timing it, documenting it in a small, private notebook. It was data, and I was a data analyst. I tried to find a pattern, a logical trigger. Was it the wind? A change in temperature? Was there a structural flaw in the building? I checked the security cameras, a recent addition to the old house. The footage showed nothing but empty rooms, bathed in the ghostly green glow of night vision. Yet the audio picked it up, a faint, rhythmic thumping that the microphone struggled to register, but it was there, undeniable. The sound existed, but the source did not. The foundation of my reality began to crack. The terrifying element wasn't just the sound itself, but its insidious implication. It suggested a story I wasn't privy to, an unseen actor moving through the spaces I was meant to be guarding. It was a violation of the fundamental law of my universe. Things that move have to be there. This was something else. A ghost in the machine, a whisper in the data. The house had a language, Eleanor had said. I was beginning to realize it wasn't speaking in groans and creaks, but in the clear, unmistakable sound of a dead man's walk. And I was the only one there to hear it. My control was an illusion, and the silence was no longer empty. It was waiting. The footsteps were the key that unlocked the door to madness, and my rational mind, in its desperation, felt an overwhelming compulsion to peer through the keyhole. The nightly pacing overhead was no longer a simple anomaly. It was a taunt, a deliberate act of intrusion into my carefully constructed reality. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. During the day, I was a ghost in my own life, hollowed out by fatigue and a gnawing anxiety. At night, I was a prisoner, strapped to a chair in a silent theater, forced to listen to a performance meant only for me. My investigation started online, with frantic, late-night searches typed with trembling fingers. Whaley House hauntings. Night guard experiences Whaley House. Ghostly footsteps. The results were a deluge of paranormal blogs, sensationalist articles, and grainy YouTube videos. It was the kind of digital noise I'd always disdained, the province of conspiracy theorists and the gullible. But now, I devoured it. I learned about the Whaley family's litany of tragedies. The death of their infant son, Thomas, from scarlet fever. The public suicide of their daughter, Violet. The armed takeover of their home when it served as the county courthouse. Then I found him, James Yankee Jim Robinson, a horse thief, a drifter, hanged from a makeshift gallows on this very property in 1852, 5 years before the house was even built. The articles described his execution in gruesome detail. The gallows were too short, and Jim, a tall man, was left to strangle slowly, his heavy boots kicking and scraping against the ground for nearly an hour. Visitors to the museum, the articles claimed, often reported hearing the sound of heavy disembodied footsteps on the second floor, right where the courtroom and the gallows once stood. A cold dread, slick and oily, coated my insides. This wasn't just a sound. It was an echo, a psychic scar left on the fabric of the place. The footsteps weren't random. They belonged to someone, a man who died badly, right where I sat. The knowledge didn't bring comfort. It brought terror. It transformed the unseen from a vague possibility into a specific, malevolent presence with a history and a name. I needed someone to validate my experience, to pull me back from the brink of what felt like impending insanity. I called my older brother, Mark, a stockbroker. Mark was even more pragmatic than I was, a man who measured the world in profit and loss. We met for coffee at a brightly lit cafe that felt a world away from the oppressive gloom of the museum. "You look like hell, Art," he said, not unkindly. I tried to explain. I kept my voice level, presenting the facts as I had documented them in my notebook. The times, the duration, the consistency of the sounds, the lack of any physical evidence. I told him about Yankee Jim. I watched his face, desperate for a flicker of belief, of understanding. Instead, I saw pity. "It's the job, man," he said, stirring his latte with a thoughtful frown. "It's messing with your head. You're alone all night in a creepy old house. Your mind is playing tricks on you. It's stress." "Mark, I have audio recordings," I insisted, my voice cracking. "You can hear it. You can hear a faint thumping that could be anything. The heating system, the plumbing, a car driving by. You're obsessing, Art. You lost your job, you're in a tough spot, and you're projecting. You need to get some sleep. Maybe see someone." I left the cafe feeling more isolated than ever. He didn't believe me. To him, I was no longer a rational man processing data. I was a fragile mind cracking under pressure. The world I knew, the one of logic and reason, was siding with him. I was the outlier, the variable that didn't fit the equation. Was he right? Was this all in my head? The thought was almost as terrifying as the alternative. My desperation led me to the local historical society archives, a musty basement filled with the ghosts of forgotten headlines. I spent an entire afternoon sifting through brittle yellowed newspapers from the 1850s, and there it was, an article from the San Diego Herald, dated September 20th, 1852. It described the public execution of James Robinson in lurid detail, but it was a single sentence, buried deep in the text, that made the air freeze in my lungs. It was a quote from Thomas Whaley himself, given to a reporter years later, after he had built his grand home on the execution grounds. He spoke of being awakened at night by the sound of heavy boots, as if a large man were pacing in the upstairs hall. He believed it was the ghost of Yankee Jim, forever walking the site of his final, agonizing moments. This was it, the key, a document, a piece of hard evidence from the past, confirming that what I was hearing was not a product of my 21st century stress. It was a phenomenon that predated me by more than a century. This wasn't my madness. It was the house's. The revelation brought a moment of pure, unadulterated terror. There was no escape. The rules of my reality had not just been bent, they had been shattered. I was facing a force that was ancient, anchored to the very soil beneath the house, and my presence there, my nightly vigil, was not just a job. It was an intrusion. I was a trespasser in a dead man's domain, and I had a sickening feeling that my intrusion had not gone unnoticed. I was no longer just listening to the past was starting to listen to me. The confirmation that Yankee Jim's restless spirit was the source of the footsteps did not bring relief. It was a declaration of war. My nightly shifts transformed from a passive listening session into an active siege. The house was no longer just a collection of rooms and artifacts. It was a living entity, and I was an unwelcome guest in its belly. The phenomena escalated, moving beyond the auditory and into the physical world with a terrifying new aggression. It started in the old courtroom. One night, as the familiar, heavy pacing began overhead, I saw it on the security monitor. A thick, leather-bound law book, one of several displayed on a shelf, slid forward and crashed to the floor. The sound was a loud, definitive thud that echoed through the silent house. I replayed the footage a dozen times. There was no tremor, no gust of wind. The book moved as if shoved by an unseen hand. My blood ran cold. This was no longer just an echo of the past. It was an interaction. The entity was demonstrating its ability to affect the physical world, to exert its will upon my reality. My isolation became absolute. Mark stopped taking my calls, convinced I was in the grip of a psychological breakdown. "Get help, Arthur," was the last thing he said to me, his voice strained with a mixture of frustration and fear. He was afraid, not of the ghost, but of me, of the man his logical, predictable brother was becoming. My attempts to explain the escalating events to Eleanor, the museum manager, were met with a serene, knowing smile. "The house has its moods," she'd said, her eyes twinkling. "It chooses who it speaks to." She was the herald, the one who knew the history and offered cryptic warnings, but she was powerless, a mere observer to my private horror. The attacks grew more personal. I would leave my jacket on the back of my chair, only to find it crumpled in a corner of the room, as if thrown in a fit of pique. The smell of cigar smoke, thick and acrid, would suddenly fill the air, a scent I later learned was associated with Thomas Whaley himself. It was as if the patriarch was manifesting his displeasure at my presence. One night, a child's laughter, faint and impossibly clear, echoed from the top of the stairs. The ghost of the infant Thomas, they said. It wasn't playful. It was chilling, a sound of innocence twisted into something deeply unsettling. My sanity began to fray at the edges. I was living on a diet of caffeine and raw fear. The rational man I once was became a distant memory. In his place was a paranoid survivor, a man who saw malevolent intent in every shadow, who jumped at every creak of the floorboards. I started talking to myself, my whispers a desperate attempt to fill the oppressive silence between the hauntings. I was losing my connection to the outside world, my reality shrinking to the four walls of that cursed house. The nights were an endless loop of dread, anticipation, and terror, My attempts to fight back were laughably pathetic. I tried leaving the lights on, hoping to dispel the shadows. The bulbs in the upstairs fixtures would burn out, one by one. I tried playing loud music from my phone, a futile attempt to drown out the silence. The battery would drain in minutes, even from a full charge. I even bought a small crucifix and placed it on my desk, a desperate act from a man who had not stepped inside a church in 20 years. The next morning, I found it snapped in two, lying on the floor. Each attempt to assert my control was met with a swift, contemptuous rebuttal. The lesson was clear. I was powerless. My rules did not apply here. I was learning a new, terrifying curriculum taught through suffering and fear. The house was breaking me down, stripping away my identity piece by piece, remaking me in its own haunted image. I was no longer just the night guard. I was becoming part of the exhibit, another tragic story held within its decaying walls. The final night was different. A storm was rolling in, pressing down on the city with a heavy, atmospheric dread. The air inside the Whaley House was thick, electric, buzzing with a palpable energy I had never felt before. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that this was it. This was the night the veil would be torn completely away. I had become so attuned to the house's malevolent rhythm that I could feel the crescendo approaching. The usual overture began just after 2 a.m. The heavy phantom footsteps of Yankee Jim started their mournful patrol in the courtroom above. But tonight, they were louder, more insistent, each step a hammer blow against the floorboards and my sanity. Then came the other sounds, a horrifying chorus joining the solo performance. A woman's heartbroken sobs echoed from Violet's bedroom. The faint, chilling giggle of a child whispered from the top of the stairs. The sharp, acrid scent of cigar smoke filled my small office. It was as if every tragedy the house had ever witnessed was replaying at once, a symphony of suffering conducted for my benefit. Then, the lights went out. Not just in the house, but the entire block. The storm had knocked out the power. I was plunged into a profound, suffocating blackness, the likes of which I had never known. My emergency flashlight, my only weapon against the dark, was on the desk. I fumbled for it, my hands shaking uncontrollably. As my fingers closed around its cool metal casing, a new sound began, a slow, deliberate scraping coming from the main parlor. I clicked on the flashlight, its powerful beam cutting a trembling path through the darkness. I swept it across the parlor. The antique furniture, the velvet ropes, the portraits on the wall with their dead, watching eyes. Everything was in its place. Yet the scraping continued, closer now. It was the sound of something heavy being dragged across the wooden floor. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I backed away, toward the rear of the gift shop, my breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. There was no escape. The electronic locks on the main doors were dead without power. I was trapped. The scraping stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse, pregnant with a terrible anticipation. I held my breath, straining my ears, my entire being focused on the impenetrable darkness of the parlor. And then I heard it. A low whisper, right beside my ear. A voice dry and raspy, like autumn leaves skittering across pavement. "Get out!" I screamed, a raw, primal sound of pure terror, and spun around, swinging the flashlight wildly. The beam caught it for a fraction of a second. A tall, shadowy figure standing in the archway to the parlor. It had no discernible features, just a man-shaped void in the darkness, but I could feel its immense presence, an aura of ancient anger and profound sorrow. In that instant, I understood. This was the house itself, the culmination of all its pain, all its tragedy, given form. It was Yankee Jim. It was Thomas and Violet. It was all of them and none of them. It was the spirit of the place, and it wanted me gone. The figure lunged forward. I didn't think. I ran. I fled through the back rooms, stumbling in the dark, my flashlight beam bouncing crazily off the walls. I found the old wooden door to the back garden, the one Eleanor had told me was bolted from the outside. I threw my shoulder against it, again and again, fueled by a surge of adrenaline I didn't know I possessed. The old wood splintered, the lock gave way, and I burst out into the rain-swept night, gasping the cool, clean air like a drowning man. I didn't look back. I just ran, leaving the house and the screaming silence behind me. I never returned. I left my meager belongings in the staff locker, forfeited my final paycheck. I couldn't explain what happened. Not to the police, not to Mark, not to anyone. How could I? I survived, but the man who ran out of that house was not the same one who had taken the job weeks earlier. The skeptical, rational analyst was gone, dead and buried under the floorboards of the Whaley House. In his place was a haunted man, a man who understood the terrible truth of the world, that the reality we build for ourselves is a fragile facade, and that ancient evils exist in the shadows, waiting for us to open the wrong door. I live in a new city now, in a bright, modern apartment on a high floor, as far from the ground as I can get. But the haunting isn't over. It never will be. The house left a scar on my soul, a permanent connection to the darkness I witnessed. Sometimes, in the dead of night, when the city is quiet, I hear it, faint but unmistakable, the sound of heavy footsteps, pacing in the room above. The house knows where I am, and it's waiting. The knowledge is its own kind of prison, a constant, chilling reminder that I survived the confrontation, but I will never, ever be truly free.